Can everybody hear me? No one can deny that U.S. involvement in Panama has irreversibly altered the course of the country's history. What we on OG are going to come and prove to you is that a Panama in which the U.S. has intervened in the ways that it has throughout history is a more financially stable Panama and a more politically stable Panama, and that these are the metrics that we should be prioritizing in this debate because they are better for all citizens and better for the global community as a whole. Okay, so first, one, the Panama in which the U.S. has intervened is a more financially stable Panama. First of all, why is this important? Financial stability is a significant outcome for how well a country does on the global stage. What it means is that it is consistently viewed as a good trade partner. It is viewed as a place that companies, international corporations want to come and build like factories or companies or whatever. It is a place where lots of people often will come to vacation. It is a place that people could see as a place where they want to spend their money and buy products from. This is good for a country, particularly a country that is small, and particularly a country that has historically been a victim of colonialism or imperialism, as Panama historically has. So, Panama specifically does benefit from this perception of itself as a financially stable place. Why is its financial stability because of the U.S. then? Two main reasons. One is the currency. Panamanian currency is keyed to the US dollar. This means that it is stable, or at least as stable as the US dollar is. Fortunately for Panamanian currency, the US dollar is considered one of the most stable currencies in the world. It is a currency that pretty much all other currencies are compared to, and it has maintained, even through significant crashes like the 2008 stock market crash, a level of stability that most other currencies do not hope to attain. So for a small country like Panama, the US is one of the best actors that it could potentially be keyed to in terms of its currency because of the stability of the US dollar. This provides us with the impacts that I described earlier of its status as being perceived as a financially stable country. So then, the second reason is because of the Panama Canal. Panama is unique in that it has the particular location in the world that it is positioned in, right? Not right now. We think that it is probably likely that the canal would have been built either way, whether the US had been involved or not. But because the US was involved with the construction of the Panama Canal from the start, it meant that it had a reputation for being associated with a country that is generally perceived as stable and had a vested interest in building the canal's reputation as a trade pathway for the entire world. We're not going to deny that the US has had ill intentions in terms of imperialism. We agree that this is something that the US has been motivated to do, but ultimately for Panama, this is a benefit in terms of the canal specifically because it meant that the US interests in the rest of the world coincided with the US interest in promoting the Panama Canal as a place of trade and as a place for the world to send their ships through. That means more trade for Panama, it means more ships passing through, it means a whole industry becomes built up around the canal, and it spawns the tourism industry for the Panama Canal specifically, which is something that many people have on their bucket list to see. You get a lot of tourism from that is good for the economy. So ultimately our impact here is that you have a Panama that has a stable currency because it is keyed to the US dollar. This is probably the most stable currency it could be keyed to, and there is no guarantee that a Panama with a currency that is not keyed to a stable other currency would have the same financial stability or the same reputation that US involvement in the area has provided. So the US's involvement, not right now, the US's involvement has ultimately made Panama a more financially stable place, and this would not have been able to be replicated with Panama on its own, and is unlikely to have been replicated by another actor, and there are a couple of reasons for this. One is that most other actors in the region did not, I think it's hard to say that there is a good actor that has come in from outside of Central or South America and become involved in the region with completely noble intentions. I think it's fair to characterize most external actors as having negative intentions within the region, but when you look at other countries that have not had the same type of involvement that Panama has from the US specifically, either they had significant destabilization, which did not occur because the US had a vested interest in maintaining the financial stability of Panama for its own interest, which again is not a morally good thing, but ultimately has this benefit of providing this financial stability for Panama. Or you have countries that do successfully shake off their imperialistic or colonialistic other countries, and then have a much harder time getting on their feet because they're perceived as unstable, they're perceived as not being great places to start corporations or send money or anything like that. So then, yeah, I'll take back half right now.
Any country can peg their currency to the dollar in the way that Ecuador did without that much US involvement. What you actually have to defend is the imperial methods that the United States use, as well as decades of reaping the majority of the financial benefits from the canal at the expense of the Panamanian people.
Yeah, sure, okay. Again, we're not saying that US involvement has been 100% wonderful, but when you look at ultimately in the region, there are other places where the US has gotten involved, or where the currency has been keyed, but we think that the specific involvement with the canal, at the very least, is unique to Panama and is not something that that other countries have been able to replicate, and so US involvement there has been irreversibly a positive thing for Panama. So our second point then is that US involvement in Panama has made the country more politically stable. Why is this important? We think that financial and political stability do sort of go hand in hand, but ultimately, political stability is probably the thing that has more of an impact on how the country interacts with other countries, and also has a significant impact on how its citizens are able to live their daily lives. We think that perception of the U.S. is generally of the U.S. as a stable and powerful actor. Obviously, there are a lot of things that the U.S. has done that are not good, but other countries on the global stage do tend to perceive the U.S. as a middleman, as a country that reaches out to other countries and brokers peace deals, etc. And so Panama having an association with the U.S. means that it is sort of under the U.S.'s quote-unquote protection, in that other countries are less likely to go after Panama specifically because they know that if they do, the U.S., because it has a vested interest in the region, is likely to defend them. And that is unfortunately why we justify the imperialistic methods that the U.S. has used in its involvement in Panama, is that if the U.S. had a different kind of involvement in Panama, it would not be incentivized to protect it in the same way, and that means that Panama would not have reaped the same benefits from the U.S. involvement that we are claiming here. So ultimately what we get is a more financially and politically stable Panama that is more successful and perceived as a good actor on the global stage. Thank you.
Prime Minister, for a final speech, call on the Leader of Opposition to the case of the damage.
I'm going to start by addressing the arguments we get out of opening opposition. And I want to flag up top that I think most of them are not really comparative. I don't think that opening opposition does a super good job of dealing with the what the actual world looks like without U.S. involvement in Panama. And we'll go through the arguments one by one and explain how this is the case. So the first thing they give us is that the Panama Canal was built anyway. Okay, that's what we said. They said that sovereignty would likely be returned earlier. That's the difference that they're going for here. But it's unclear to me why France would return it earlier. The argument that they're trying to make is that France has less stake in the region than the U.S., but I don't necessarily think that that actually incentivizes returning it earlier, right? The U.S. being so close, I think, has more international scrutiny on its relations with Latin America. I think that U.S. sort of imperialism in Latin America is a much larger issue on a global stage than European imperialism. I think that there is less pressure on European nations to be pulling out of Latin America than there is on the United States to do so. I think that there is less of a sort of headwind in the there's a greater headwind in the United States to sort of get rid of the sort of imperial remnants within Latin America than there is in France. So I don't actually think that it's clear why that would likely be returned earlier. I think it's probably at best along the same timeline and at worst slightly later. I don't think that's a big difference either way. They talk about dollarization. I think that this is where we start to get some just factually wrong claims, like tourists don't like spending in US dollars. That's not true. Tourists like spending their money efficiently. Tourists who come from wealthier nations to Panama will find that things are significantly cheaper here. It doesn't really matter what currency you're spending. What matters is how far your dollar goes if you're a tourist, and it goes significantly farther in Panama than it does, for instance, in the United States. And I think that that's really an important thing. I think that tourists also prefer the ease of a familiar currency. If you get US dollars in Panama, you can spend them almost anywhere. You can exchange them almost anywhere. It's just slightly more convenient. That's not a big impact, but it is a reason why tourists might prefer USD. I also think that it makes US tourism stronger. I think that this is the sort of key, this is one of the key impacts that opening government is pushing, is that the sort of tie between the United States and Panama makes people across the world sort of perceive Panama in a more touristic sort of sense. It makes it feel more accessible to the Western world. I think that actually increases tourism rather than decreasing it. I think that there's a certain amount of implicit bias that people have against going to Latin American countries that is somewhat ameliorated by the tie to the United States that we have here. Let's talk about the Darien Gap. I think that it's sort of ridiculous to claim that the U.S. government is the reason why the Darien Gap is a problem. The Panamanian government doesn't want people traveling through the Darien Gap. The Panamanian government wants to close its borders, right? It wants to prevent migration because there is, massive problem with human trafficking. There's a massive problem with drug cartels, with gangs, and I think that the Panamanian government is not really incentivized to create a humanitarian highway, as the opening proposition is suggesting. I think that it's much more likely to close its borders and to just sort of leave the region to continue in its current state, to possibly get worse once the border is closed. Yes.
Joe Biden literally stopped the Panamanian government from any proposal they actively had to do with humanitarian
I don't, I don't know about the particular proposal that you're talking about. I don't see like structural reasons why it is likely to pass. I think that's what you need to prove that point there, is you need some sort of reason why the Panamanian government, free from U.S. influence, free from all historical U.S. influence, is unlikely to pass that. I think that you just simply haven't met your burden here. Maybe you'll do it in the DLO. Now let's talk about opening government's case and rebuilding that. I think that up top, the issue that you should care most about in this debate is the stability of the nation along both political and financial lines, right? The impact here, instability does massive harm to citizens. There's less access to resources, higher poverty rates, greater mortality, greater corruption in government, more coups, potential rise in authoritarianism, right? We've seen this recently in Venezuela, the result is people fleeing en masse, rise in violence experienced both in the nation and during the migration process. So we think that overall, political stability, economic stability is incredibly important, probably the most tangible thing that directly impacts citizens' lives. And we think that that is the most important metric on which the debate should be weighed. We think that the good done for governments, for powerful actors, is only so good as the good that's passed on to the average person. So it's really a matter of what best affects Panamanian citizens. And we also think that most benefits that opposition team might try to push just aren't accessible without stable government, without stable economics, right? Solving the problem in the Darien Gap, solving tourism problems, solving the problem of whether or not it's going to be a tax haven, right? I think that it's hard to access these benefits without this stable government, without a stable economy. Because these benefits don't really matter to people until their base material needs and liberties are fulfilled. So I think that the core of this is that we think that is why the stability is the most important impact of the debate. To talk about why then briefly rebuild, yeah, let's do this.
Even if your economic argument is true, this is bad for Panama because it exacerbates inequality in a way that hurts the most vulnerable Panamanians in rural areas.
I think that the question of economic instability, again, it's a question of where's the comparative here. Like, obviously, U.S. investment, obviously, in any sort of capitalist country, there's going to be massive inequality. How does the U.S. involvement exacerbate that? Unclear. I think that the key to financial stability, more so even than U.S. currency dollarization impacts on the tourist industry, is that there's just a greater investment from wealthier nations, right? I think that wealthy nations see that the U.S. has significant economic involvement in Panama, and then other countries recognize that the U.S. is massively incentivized to keep the dollar stable, is massively incentivized to keep the Panamanian economy stable because it has investment here. I think that draws more foreign investment in, right? It makes Panama seem a place where other countries can safely invest, and that draws in greater investment, which brings an influx of wealth to Panama. Question of distribution, I think, is likely symmetrical in terms of whether or not it's going to be distributed fairly. That doesn't matter as much. I don't think the U.S. government really cares too much on a day-to-day basis how that money actually works. And then I think the other question, similarly, that involvement makes it seem more politically stable.
economic benefits and diplomatic benefits to Panama, and we think that in the absence of the U.S., it would have been significantly harder to build the canal. Note, this is not a knife to OG. You're saying that it would have been much difficult and taken a lot longer of a time, and this time trade-off is what has allowed Panama to accelerate their economic growth. Okay, firstly, I think that some framing. I think it's important to note that outside of the canal, Panama's a relatively small country, and there not as many natural resources within Panama compared to other potentially South American or Central American countries. I think what this means is that the Panama Canal uniquely has been a catalyst for economic activity and economic growth within Panama, and we're going to prove to you why we think that it would have been significantly harder to build a canal without the U.S. A few mechanisms. Number one, it was just very, very expensive to build at the time. The U.S. paid for it in its entirety, and we think that without the U.S. paying for it, it's number one, very unlikely that Panama, the country itself, would have been able to pay for it. So we would have had to have a second actor, or an outside actor doing it anyways. And we think secondly, because the U.S. controlled that piece of land of the canal, it made it very easy for the U.S. to facilitate the construction and the development as well as funding for the canal. So it was built in a very reasonable amount of time in a very efficient manner. Secondly, we think that at the time of when the Panama Canal was being considered, there were also alternatives being considered. Note that there are shipping routes in other parts of the world, through the Horn of Africa, for example. Other countries within Central America were also considered for some type of canal, like Nicaragua. We think that there were also considerations of building a trade route instead, rather than a canal, and it didn't need to be in Panama. So there were a lot of alternatives presented on the table, and we think that because the U.S. uniquely controlled that piece of land and had the money to do so because of the unique U.S. involvement, the canal ended up getting built within Panama, uniquely because of the U.S. involvement. And thirdly, we think the technology was just very advanced for its time. I don't really know how the engineering works, but the locks in the water, it seems very complicated. I'm sure that maybe the canal would have been built eventually, but it probably would have been many years down the line when Panama had had the engineering capacity to do so. And we think that the time trade-off is very crucial here. So why do we think that it's very why do we think the Panama Canal being at that time when it was built, why was it so good for Panama? We think it essentially, no thank you, accelerated the growth of the Panamanian economy. Why do we think this is the case? So number one, obviously this became a major trade route in the world, and we think that a lot of ships passed through, which sparked economic activity in the area. But secondly, we think this led to a lot of foreign direct investment in countries outside of Panama, investing in Panama City, because they saw this as a very strategic location to expand their businesses because they saw the potential economic activity driven by the canal. So we think that Panama uniquely received foreign direct investment and investments from elsewhere that it otherwise would not have to accelerate their investment or to accelerate their development. We think that in the absence of the canal, what would have happened in Panama is that Panama would have developed at a much slower pace, and we think this it would have followed a more traditional path of development. The issue with this is, no thank you, the traditional path of development is going from a primary to secondary industries to tertiary industries. But Panama uniquely does not have that much land to begin with to do things like agricultural activities. It doesn't have that many natural resources or commodities that it can trade. So we think that Panama's economic growth would have been far slower without the canal in place. The canal brought in investment and it brought in economic activity worldwide. And we think that this economic activity is good because it improved the quality of life for Panamanian citizens. Recognize that, I think CO had a POI where they talked about how there's massive economic disparity within Panama. Yes, this is true, but this is true for a lot of Central American countries. We think that in the case where the canal was not built, it would have been even worse, and we think that more of the population would have had even worse quality of life because the economic development would have been far slower. So we think that when we talk about the comparative
back the U.S. control of the Caribbean for 70 years.
Okay,
What was it called?
I think firstly, it's unclear why France would have given back the canal any earlier. Like, the canal is very economically strategic. I think France would have kept it for just as long, if not longer. Secondly, this brings me to my point about canal neutrality, right? We think there's unique diplomatic benefits. We think that Panama is perceived as a neutral actor in facilitating global free trade, and that Panama is benefits from this canal neutrality. So canal neutrality is just it can't be used for diplomatic or political reasons. Panama cannot deny countries from using the canal, but that also means that other countries can't attack Panama for their canal. And we think this is uniquely able to happen because there's a clause in this neutrality thing that says that no military is allowed in this canal except the U.S. one. And we think that the U.S. military having the ability to make this canal neutral is what keeps it neutral. We think that without this means that countries would attack Panama, including countries that our opposition wants to talk about, would have attacked Panama because it was so strategic. And we think that France uniquely is so far away, it's on the other side of the world, and France uniquely would not have put in this would not be willing to use their military to protect the canal neutrality. So we think canal neutrality is uniquely important, and it has allowed Panama to gain diplomatic benefits. Propose.
Government before a final speech. Member of opposition to extend the case for the bench.
When it's boiled down, countries are necessarily made up of two things: society and the economy. Our extension from CO is going to be very simple, explaining to you why both Panamanian society and the economy has been exponentially harmed by the US's mass involvement with the canal. Few things in this speech. First, I'm going to give you some brief responses to what we just heard out of CG, then moving into our first point about social stratification, our second about a resource curse, and finally weighing over why we beat OO. First thing I want to do then is why we think that CG does not take this debate. To give you a few things. The first is that the canal would have been built way slower. They spent a lot of minutes of their first speech talking about this. To be honest, that's fine characterization. We don't really have a very big stake on this debate and this clash about whether the canal would have been built by France or by another country or slower. I think our arguments work on both sides. Second thing they tell you is that the canal is the only thing that would give Panama money that it has gotten and resources that it has gotten, because it doesn't have, for example, some resources that other South American or Central American countries might have. I think that first, that's just not that. First of all, that's asserted, and also I think that just looking at Panama, it's probably very clear that they do have some resources, right? Which is to say that they have, for example, mass amounts of rainforests that could have definitely been used to get wood, etc. But second, also, Panama is a tropical area. They certainly at least have the resource of being able to satisfy tourists who love tropical areas. The final thing that they tell you that I think is important for our case is that they think that diversification of Panamanian economy exists in the status quo. First, I think this is an assertion, but second, I also think that diversification does not equal to spending a very small amount of your GDP or your money on a very few amount of industries and spending the vast majority on something else. That is the reality of the status quo. But a final at their highest ground of response, which is that any diversification that exists in the Panamanian economy right now has only happened post-Panama being in control of the canal. And we think that the alternative and the comparative is that if they had control of their economy much sooner, then they would have been able to have this diversification much sooner. First point then on social stratification. I think there have been 3 steps that have stratified Panama socially through the U.S.'s involvement. The first is intense U.S. intervention meant the westernization of elites in Panama, which I think is true for 2 reasons. First, because local elites are example, Hollywood movies. They didn't have TikTok back then, but I'm sure it exists here also now. The second thing, though, that I think is really important is about mass importization of US culture. And I think that this is really problematic, primarily from elites, but also from businesses that likely moved in. For example, there were probably a lot of US chains, food chains, and also like departmental stores that came to Panama to try to satisfy the US population that moved to Panama when the canal was being built, the elites, etc. The third reason is that I think because the US established quasi-colonialism and gave citizenry, US citizenship, to individuals who were born within the Panama Canal Zone, they developed a sort of second-class citizenry within Panama, which is to say that you were either a US citizen or you were not a US citizen. You were either somebody who had one of the strongest passports in the world, you had access to relatively wealthy neighborhoods because you were born in the Panama Canal Zone, and you had direct protection from the United States, or you were not. And I think that this led to a few impacts. The first is the polarization of politics. I think that you got less empathy on an individual level because people were unable to relate to each other because of the second class, or because of the two classes of citizenry. The second is that I think you also got politicians that were much more pro-American. And obviously this is true for like the dictators that O talks about. But I think that this is also true past the dictators and in the status quo. Because I think that we outweigh them here because the likelihood of our characterization of politics, which is that politicians are much more likely to be pro-American, voted into office, for example, is more likely to exist far into the future beyond the time period that dictators had existed, that they said, even though like everything they said about dictators is also true. I think the final impact that you get is crowding out of indigenous culture. And I think this is particularly harmful because it would not happen otherwise. Which brings me to the comparative, which is that maybe there was some westernization of elites. It's probably unlikely that you can stave that off for very long. But I think it is true that it would have happened as fast and it would not have been as much. Because if other countries invested in Panama, it is likely that A, they would have been able to compete regardless of which characterization you use of when the canal was built, but B, also that Panamanian indigenous and local culture would likely have existed and have kept on existing because they would not have faced such a mass amount of push from the United States in terms of culture. Second thing then I want to talk about is resource curse. I think the characterization here is that the canal was built and Panama was developed incredibly quickly. And I think CG gives you an information about this, but basically it was pumped with US funding, FDI, etc. And the US had an incentive to develop it incredibly quickly because it was entering into an era of being a superpower in the global order. I think the very fast development was bad for Panama because Panama, the Panamanian economy did not diversify, which is to say that if development had happened slower, Panama might have invested in other industries, like manufacturing, perhaps like their rainforest industry, or tourism. Instead, Panama is incentivized to funnel lots of money towards growth and upkeep of the canal. And before I continue, if there's a video, I don't know. Okay, I think the canal has led to some stability, as the government bench has said, but I think this flows into this argument, which is to say that if it's stable, people are investing, that only adds to the mass industrialization and development of Panama and a lack of diversification. I think dependency via a lack of diversification is really problematic for Panama for three reasons. First, because of climate change problems. The past year in rising sea levels has seen a lot of problems for Panamanian officials trying to fix the Panama Canal with regards to climate change. And I think this will only happen further into the future. Second is the rural and urban divide that Mariana POI. But third, I think that the current economic partnership and continued dependency on the United States into the future is unlikely to break if you have this very historic economic tie in the past. The comparative is the economy wouldn't have been reliant on only the canal. Other countries would not have been as one-track minded as the United States or as close, and economic isolation wouldn't exist. Very quickly on why I think we outweigh over OO, we give you reasons as to why the building of the Panama Canal and how it happened, which is a certainty, was bad. They give you reasons as to why the comparative, which they didn't defend properly, could have been much better, but we win on certainty because we talk about how it was actually built. Very proud to stand with closing up.
my speech will start in 3, 2, 1. Panel, we explained how the time trade-off, i.e. the amount of time in which the Panama Canal, in between the Panama Canal being built on our side of the house and not built on opposition side of the house, led to significant enough economic, political, and trade-based harm that it would be fundamentally way more impactful to Panamanian citizens than any other team in this round. So proud to propose. So, first of all, differentiating ourselves from opening gun. We tell you about this time trade-off. We say also that, Panama would diversify so much more slowly without the US specific involvement. Note that this applies even if, France is the counterfactual. Again, US is way more powerful than France. It has way more of an ability to invest in Panama. It has way more of an ability to defend Panama. More on that later. But also just Panama by itself, or Panama with a less strong or less invested, person helping it, would be, struggling with not having many resources, with, not having much foreign direct investment, and from not being able to diversify its economy. My partner uniquely tells you how we manage to diversify Panama's economy. Okay, no, not yet. Yeah. We also note that OG talks about how, political stability and how, stability from the US. We actually explain why this is true by explaining things like the canal neutrality and how the US is actually outlined to be helping Panama. Additionally, we explain how the Panama Canal makes Panama somewhat of a target, both in terms of trade, as well as even potentially in the highest impact scenario, militarily, because without this US investment, the canal is an incredibly important resource to control trade to the entire world. Panama needs a very powerful supporter to back up the influence of the canal. Okay, moving on to closing opposition. Here we go. Okay, so first to address the refutation they provided to us. They say that Panama actually does have resources, that it does not need the canal in order to diversify and in order to build this economy. The two things they point out here are tourism resources and natural resources. First on tourism. I will note that this is very difficult if you have a bad economy and bad politics, which they are way more likely to have, on their side of the house. On our side of the house, we are able to get tourism partly through the good economy and the good politics that is uniquely propped out by the US. Also, on natural resources, Panama again is very small, so even if they are using all of the natural resources at their disposal, it's first of all not that many, so the difference is marginal. They are also likely to run out, and in the process of doing so, they will decimate their environment, which will A, hurt the tourism industry, and B, is probably bad because we care about the environment. Okay, they also talk about diversification, saying that it only happened after control of the canal. If they had control sooner, the argument goes this diversification would happen. This is simply not true. You cannot diversify the Panamanian economy without the income of the canal. It is just not possible. The Panama Canal and its construction resulted in a huge influx of foreign direct investment, as well as just by making the Panamanian economy more palatable on the global stage. This only happened with the US influence because of how powerful the US is, both in terms of hard power, ability to defend the canal, as well as also just its soft power. So, without having this huge influx of funds, you are just not able to build your economy from the ground up. Note again, Panama's lack of significant natural resources, lack of significant industry outside of this. Okay, at the very least, even if they had managed to diversify somewhat, it would not be nearly as much as we get on our side of the house. We explain to you why this is uniquely important. Okay, they also talk on this social stratification point, basically saying that people are more inclined to US culture and there's more of an income differential within Panamanian society. First of all, I don't think it is explained why the US culture influence is specifically bad, but even insofar as we buy that there is income inequality, this simply does not matter if we are benefiting the worst off in society as well. I.e., if the Panama Canal and the income from it, the diversification and all of the benefits my partner brings you, helps everyone in Panamanian society, which we show that it does, it doesn't matter as much if there is an income difference. We think this is still better for everyone in society. We also think that this is somewhat mitigated just by the fact that the economic benefits do help other industries rise from the ground. I.e., when Panama is more available to tourism, this helps small businesses who can create themselves and run off of selling souvenirs to tourists. All the souvenirs that look the exact same in a shop or whatever. Okay, so we also specifically tell you the impact of economic growth. So to just very, very distinctly outline how Panamanian citizens benefit from this and why agree on closing government money. Okay, so the impact of economic growth is essentially just that it will trickle down throughout society. That if you have your overall economy being better, it means that the infrastructure you build is better. It means that the wages are higher. It means that there are going to be more jobs and more good jobs which allow people to rise in the ranks in society. I.e., the US and its investment provide Panama with the kind of jobs that actually allow people to rise in society, to break out of any kind of social barrier that they are facing. At the very, very least, we achieve more of this on our side of the house. This also provides people with the ability to spend money elsewhere. Note, this is helped by dollarization as well, because people are now able to move abroad, to invest abroad, to become more part of the global economy. We think this is overall helping everyone in Panama. Exists even with inequality. What is the alternative to this? The alternative is a huge reliance on natural commodities, which causes enormous volatility, which causes both recessions economically and political harms. I'll take one minute.
The Panama Canal is beneficial to Panamanians when they control it. Because giving it to Panama would have meant additional costs to the dominantly US businesses that move through it, the US uniquely held it for 17 years.
The point is the Panama Canal either would not have been built or would have been built significantly slowly without it. Note, all of these impacts that I'm talking about apply throughout the time difference between when it is built by the US on our side and when it is built by France or whoever on your side, which will be a lot slower. So the extent of time in which all of these benefits are happening is the delta by which we win this debate. Okay, finally to address opening. So they talk about this Darien Gap crisis. First of all, please note, this would happen anyway. Migration is always going to be happening because Panama is the chokehold in Central America. Anyone going from South to North America goes through Panama. The Darien Gap is a jungle. You cannot just build infrastructure. The only way for you to build infrastructure in the Darien Gap is with significant funding, significant political capital, which Panama by itself does not have. The US at least give them a better chance at having this. I do also want to note, they talk about this tax haven status. I think the tax haven is actually causing an influx of FDI to Panama, so it might not necessarily be harmful. It is again benefiting investment and the economy overall, and therefore the citizens. What do you propose?
And for a fine speech, from the opposition votes. Please, David.
I'm so sorry. If we're going to go to the bathroom, I don't want to cause a diplomatic incident by trying to wait 7 minutes.
That's
Is that
absolutely
okay?
fine. Dave can come back in there during the speech, if that's okay.
Of course.
Yeah.
The Latin American curse is defined by decades of sluggish growth and persistent inequality, where cities like Panama City host international firms in high-rise buildings while the majority of the population and ethnic minorities struggle under the poverty line. This is a result of three things that happen on-site government. First, economic dependence on foreign actors like America that take more than they give and that own your sources of economic growth, like the United States owned the Panama Canal for literally decades. Secondly, economic specialization that means countries are extremely vulnerable to shocks, as Genevieve talked to you on climate change, reducing massively the amount of revenue that the Panamanian government received this year because of droughts around the area, and that concentrates wealth in the already privileged white elites that are the most likely to align themselves economically and politically with America. And thirdly, a fractured society that, because of a lack of empathy and because of the concentration of political capital, will structurally fail to pull up the needy. Now, why does this beat the analysis that was brought to you by opening government? By opening opposition, sorry. I think crucially, we have a massively larger margin of win and larger delta on our side of the house than they do. They talk about they talk about tourism, they talk about gang violence and the Darien Gap. However, the main reason why the Darien Gap hasn't been developed is because it's like physically very difficult for a highway to be developed in the Darien Gap. There's mountains, there's rainforests, there's a massive fucking river that runs between it. They had to prove the comparative, which I don't believe that they were able to do. They talk about how the US not liking migration is the reason why the Darien Gap hasn't been developed. But the closed borders of the US is mostly a 21st century policy. During the 20th century, the US actually allowed and welcomed a lot of migrants, etc. I just don't believe that this is like a massively historically accurate argument, even though I like the spirit of it, and I think it's good. Lastly, they talk about dictatorships and how the US funded dictatorships in Latin America. While this is true, and I think that this is a very substantial argument in terms of like the amount of individuals that died, dictatorships were a wave in Latin America. Democracy emerged regionally in the 80s because of the growth of things such as labor unions and the growth of the middle class, etc. What they have to prove to you is that democracy would have like emerged in the comparative, and they had to prove to you exclusivity. I believe that our arguments are massively more exclusive. We have a larger margin, therefore we beat our opening. Now, I want to talk about why we beat closing government first. What they had to prove to you for their arguments to be salient is that the economic capacity of Panama is reduced to the fact that it is a skinny strip of land, and therefore it is easy for the United States or for another actor to like build a canal there, and they're agreeing with me. This is just not true. Panama does have a huge amount of natural resources, hence the reason why it is one of the mining hubs in Latin America. It has a lot of foreign companies that are extracting resources in the same way that they do in a lot of Latin American countries. It also has a massive amount of tourism, because of its islands, because of its beaches, its unique wildlife, its rainforests, etc. These are things that would have likely developed anyway because they are part of the economic capacity of the country. For their argument to prove to you, they actually had to address these things. Lastly, they tell us that diversification in the economy of Panama only happened because of the money of the Panama Canal. First, they don't prove the capacity to access this money in the first place. Insofar as the United States owned the canal, the United States decided which boats could go through. They don't actually prove where this revenue comes from. But even if they barely prove capacity, they don't prove the incentive for the economy to diversify, which is what Genevieve talks about in her speech. We tell you when politicians are lining their pockets with deals that they make with the United States companies, they are likely to be pro-American, and they are likely to not really give a fuck about tourism or mining or all of the other economic activities that Panama could be doing. Secondly, we talk about when there's a westernization of elites that are also economically benefiting from the canal and economically benefiting from this investment, then the political power in Panama doesn't want economic diversification. Therefore, it happens way slower on their side of the house as opposed to our side of the house. I think this is really, really bad. Second argument that they bring is this notion that like canal neutrality is really good because it promotes safety in Canada. I think supply chains matter to everyone. This is something that we saw through like the Russia-Ukraine war. This is something that has been true historically. If a canal existed, people are not going to bomb the canal because I want my boats to go through the canal so that I can sell my goods like on the other side of the American continent. I don't believe that this was an exclusive benefit that they were able to prove. But now, I want to talk about why I think the policy of economic isolation massively hurts Panama in a way that outweighs the very poorly mechanized benefits that they bring you inside government. Note that this analysis is going to apply to both closing government and opening government. I think that crucially, the comparative on our side of the house is one where you have a multiplicity of sources of investment, and this is crucially better for the economic growth that you have in your country. Why is it more likely that there's a multiplicity of investment in Panama? First of all, in terms of historical context, the involvement of America in Panama happened after World War I, where the United States was establishing itself as a global power, then it intervened itself with like the Cold War, etc., which means that there was an existential deterrent for other countries to engage in Panama, because the United States sort of had a monopoly of violence over the global sphere at that end. To that extent, the American intervention and the American presence in Panama itself necessarily crowded out investment from other sources, which I think was very, very bad. Secondly, I think because of theory of trade, in the absence of this happening, then there would have been other countries that would be interested in Panama because it has mineral resources, because of like its unique geography, etc., etc. Why is this very, very important? I think because if you have a competition of multiple investors, they can invest in different aspects of your economy. You get better goods, better terms of trade because you're competing against each other for your attention, etc. And you own your fucking canal. Yes.
Other countries would not invest in other countries in Central America at this time. Why specifically would they go towards Panama? Why, like, the benefits that...
Thank you. I think that's an assertion, first of all. But second of all, I think I gave you mechanisms that it invests in Panama, which means that this investment happens slower, and so it allows for more economic diversification in the way that the economy develops. I think that that is really, really important. Lastly, I want to address opening governments more directly beyond this analysis of like isolation. I think that I think that they had to prove to you the way that they analyze their argument is by saying right now there's a lot of tourism and there's a lot of investment, and that is sort of the way that the Panamanian economy has grown, and the US intervened, therefore it must be a causal relationship. But they actually had to prove to you this causal relationship, which I don't think that they do, which very much harms their ability to actually access their impacts in terms of like economic growth and in terms of political stability, etc. They don't prove that these are inherent in the policy, the specific policy that the United States had. At the end of the day, we have a way more sustainable way for Panama to develop economically. I think we have the biggest margin in this debate, and we have the strongest mechanisms, and for those reasons, very proud to be on top.
Any other questions for a final speech? And everyone vote for the debate. Leave, shake hands, make friends. That would be fantastic. Thank you.